In this Luminar AI photo editing tutorial, I am just going to freestyle on this photo and see where we go. A lot of people have been asking me about the local adjustment masks, and so I want to include a couple of those as part of my edit, so we will do that. As I often say to you, I think it's really important to assess your image before you go too far with the editing process and kind of have a rough idea where you want to take it. If you're just not sure where you want to take a photo, a good place to start is just to jump into the templates, and Luminar makes suggestions for you. But I'm not even going to click any of those. I don't want to be influenced. I just want to freestyle my own edit. So I'm just going to come into the edit tab here, and we're going to start in the essentials section and go from there. So I can see that we have a big cloud mass to the top right here, and that's kind of like brooding, interesting cloud, and I'd really like to bring out more detail in that and emphasize that brooding nature and the sort of dichotomy we have between what's going on here in the top right and then the sky that's going on here, which is more of a sunrise and a softer look. So I'm going to actually enhance that and bring out more of this sunrise effect here while darkening this area. And just to help demonstrate the local masking feature, what I think I'd like to do is also bring out more structure, more detail just through the sand area in the foreground. So before I do any local masking, what I like to do is get my photo looking pretty good as a starting point. So to start off with, I feel like we are overexposed. So I'm going to bring the exposure down to the left. I'm going to have a little play with smart contrast, and straight away you can see if I push that to the right, we start to emphasize the fact that this is a darker, moody blue cloud, and we're also darkening the foreground here. And it's just creating a little bit more visual interest. So I don't want to overbake it, so let's go somewhere around that 50 mark. By bringing down the highlights, I know that we can certainly protect this area through here, but overall I feel like it's flattening out the image, and we're getting a little bit of an HDR look that is not a favorable one. And so while I might want to protect those highlights a little bit, I don't want to take that too far. If I grab the shadows and push them up, we can see we're pretty much exclusively affecting the sand in the foreground. And I was quite liking the fact that that was darkening off, but I don't want things to be too dark. I'm feeling like it's the bottom right hand side that's darkening off, and that's what we're bringing back there. So what I think I'd like to do is actually use a little bit of brightening to brighten this area here, but then with my local adjustments create a more uniform darkening right from left to right and fading in to the horizon line. So we can address that shortly. Let's jump into Accent AI, and I think this is one of the most powerful sliders in Luminar AI. If I push it all the way to the right, sure, it's totally overdone, but you can see that it addresses many things, including saturation, contrast, local contrast, protecting highlights, boosting shadows. It's doing so much for us. And I normally feel like, even though 100% is usually far too much, I like to just tickle in a little bit of this effect. Let's go for about 30 today. We can turn that off and turn it on. And we're kind of losing the soft glow that we had before. If you see this, while it's off, we've got a more dreamy, ethereal kind of look. And I really like that. But I also like the clarity and detail that's being brought out with Accent AI. So I think I will actually reintroduce a little bit of a glow with one of Luminar's creative tools, such as Mystical or the actual glow filter itself. Now, I didn't play around with the actual white balance, so let's just have a little look. If we warm it up, we're warming up the picture as a whole, and I don't really want to do that. I want to keep a nice balance between the blue in the cloud here and the orange highlight coming through where the sun is rising here. So I don't really want to change that too much. If we play with our tint, we can push towards the green, or we can push towards a magenta. And I actually like a little subtle shift just towards that magenta. Now, one thing I haven't done, which I always recommend you doing, particularly if you're working in RAW, you're going to have access to this, not so if you're working with a JPEG file, but choose a profile which is specific to your camera, and we could go for something like landscape, and that's going to add more punch into this. I normally like to work with something that's neutral so that I can actually control the contrast level myself, or if I do want a little more contrast, I'll just come to camera standard. I find that the landscape and vivid just push things too far straight away. I like to have that control of how much contrast I want myself. And while we're talking about dealing with the actual file itself and adding a profile to it, another thing that's totally worth doing is come into the Pro section, and within optics, one thing you may want to do is turn on auto distortion corrections, and Luminar is reading from your camera data and applying a correction based on the lens that photo was taken with. That will only work if you've shot in RAW, because that data is available to Luminar. If it's a JPEG file, you're not going to have this option. You can also remove chromatic aberrations, which you're not going to see from this kind of view, but if you were zoomed right in, and let's just do that to show you, and I turn the chromatic aberrations off, you'll see that we have a slight magenta fringing here, and if I was to go over to the other side of the image, you'd probably see a cyan on the other side. But anyway, you click that box and that fringing is pretty much taken care of, but you also have defringe, which you can add as well. And just by turning those options on, we've pretty much eliminated any of the fringing and chromatic aberration, which is great. While we are in here, I can see that we are slightly soft in this image. We are by no means as sharp as I would like. So let's jump back into the essentials. Let's come into details and let's grab the sharpen slider and let's push it all the way to 100 and see what it does. So we've got a halo that's being created around these, which is not really what we want. So let's come into sharpening, masking, and just have a play with these sliders and see if we can't minimize that effect. If we push the sharpening radius up whilst the masking is up, we get a slightly more kind of painterly feel, but we still get some nice sharp edges. But that's not really the look I'm after for this one. I want to bring that radius down and just subtly start to bring it into a point where I feel a little happier about that. And let's bring the amount back down. If we turn this off and we turn it on, I think that's a nice compromise. We're sharpening the image without too much of a halo effect. So again, off and on. And if you felt like it was introducing too many artifacts into the sky and over sharpening that, you can obviously use your mask and just paint in the effect where you want it, which would be over the detail areas, but I'm not going to worry about doing that for this demonstration. We will just apply that globally. Okay, let's just come back to fit on screen. Now I'm going to jump into the color section because I feel like this is a really good place to actually work with individual colors. What I'll often do is actually oversaturate the image just while I'm working with the individual colors, just so I get a better sense for what my changes are doing. And with the hue section, we can actually take colors one way or another, push them in certain directions. So that's really good for creating color balances and harmonizing colors through your scene. We could take our blue cloud and make it more cyan if we wanted. But I'm kind of happy roughly where it is. I feel like the purples are a little strong, so we'll just drop those towards the blues. If you really want to get crazy, you can shift the hue of your photo, but that's not really something I want to do, but it's kind of cool just sending it in a negative direction. No, let's not go too far with that. Let's do a little bit of it, maybe something like -3. Now what I might like to do is actually just bump up the saturation of the oranges and the yellows, and even the reds as well. Now we haven't actually got any green in this, so I just pushed that up out of habit, because what I like to do is if I'm pushing one color all the way up, say the orange, what I would like to do is rather than leave the red and yellow either side exactly where they are, I like to bring them up as well, so you get a smoother transition through the oranges into the other colors. So I would also bring up the reds slightly and the yellows. If we wanted to desaturate the blues and make it more of a grey cloud, we could do that, but I'm really enjoying the blues here. If I want to brighten or darken the sunrise section here, I could certainly do that through this luminance section here and grab the oranges and brighten those up. Same for the reds, brighten those up. And as you wiggle it back and forth, you kind of get a sense of what's being brightened and what's being darkened. But sometimes with sunrises or sunsets, if things are a little too bright, you can actually get the color that's related to that and actually bring the luminance down. But in this case, it's not really creating a nice clean look, so I'll just leave that alone for now. We'll jump into the creative section. I don't want to do anything with the sky as such because I'm happy with the sky we've got. Sun rays is often a nice addition if you have a sun in your actual scene, but because the sun is still rising, that would actually look pretty fake. Let me just throw one in just so you can kind of see. Let's place the sun center just down here. I mean, sure, we could do that as if it's just rising behind this section here and then delete it or rub it out from the foreground here and just have it going up in the sky. In fact, let's do that. And I love this with Luminar because oftentimes I'm playing around with things and I just change direction on what I'm thinking I want to do. So I'm going to increase the warmth of the sun rays so they better fit in with our scene. You certainly don't want white sun rays, you want to warm them up a little bit, right? We could increase our sun radius, so we're just getting a little bit more bleed out over here, and that will just help to soften that transition through there. And I notice we're getting a little bit of a strange effect going on with the clouds just here, so let's have a look if we can play with the sliders here and just improve that somewhat. The penetration slider just sort of dictates how strong those rays are, how much they're actually going to penetrate through items within your scene. And so really that should be affecting whether or not it penetrates through this little area here. So I'm not quite sure why the AI is getting confused with that. But look, let's just sort of leave this somewhere around there, jump into the ray setting, and we can change the number of rays, or we could increase it up something like this. Let's do that. Let's go for more rays than I'd normally go for. We can randomize it just until we get something we like the look of. And now we're going to come into our mask. So we can paint out the foreground here. So I'm going to erase, and I'm going to crank the opacity all the way to 100. So we're getting the full erasure going on here, and quickly smash out all of that from the foreground. And once I let go, we now just have our rays up here, which is cool. And now I'm going to erase from the top part with a lower opacity and do that in a couple of sweeps. So I'm using the bracket keys to increase the size of my brush, and I'm just going to start to erase those sun rays from up there, and perhaps a little bit off the side here as well. And I'm thinking now I'm seeing them here in this context, they are a little bit fakey, so I'm just going to really knock them back with another couple of swipes of the eraser so that they're much more subtle in the scene. So let's turn that off, turn it on, and we're actually darkening the corners of the frame as well with this effect. And that comes down to this overall look slider. So if you don't want to do that, just push the overall look to 100, and then all you're going to get is the rays themselves. So now if I turn that off and on, you can see that we've just added in those rays. I said that I wanted to add in some glow, so we could either add some mystical. So if I start to crank that up, you'll see that we're reintroducing a sort of softening of this image and giving that a nice hazy look. One other thing we could do is use the glow filter here and either introduce some autumn effect to soften things up again, or perhaps the soft autumn effect. Let's choose that and bump that up. I might just put a little bit of that in, and maybe a little bit of the mystical as well. Nothing too much. So now let's jump into our masking section. And probably the three masks that I'm thinking I will be using will be one to control the darkness of this cloud area here, one to deal to where the sun is coming up here and soften this area, brighten it, and probably push the color temperature more towards that yellow-orange color palette. And then we're going to introduce another mask just to increase the local contrast and detail of the sand here. So we're going to add a basic mask. I'm going to paint it in with 100% to start with, and to start with all I'm going to see is just the mask that I'm actually painting in. So it has a zero effect at the moment because we haven't changed any sliders. But now if I start moving these sliders around, we can see that we can control exactly over that cloud. And I might darken it down just a little bit. And this is the cool thing. Now I'm grabbing the contrast slider. We're just able to start playing around with this and see exactly what we want to do. What are these sliders doing for this area here? I certainly think that structure is going to be a worthy addition, and for sure it's bringing out all the detail in the cloud here, and that's really cool. I feel like we're slightly oversaturated now, so I'm just going to bring either the saturation down, or what we could do is bring the vibrance down slightly, or we can do a little bit of both. So let's turn that off, and now we turn it on again. And we've got that brooding cloud effect that I was talking about earlier that I wanted to create. Now let's see if we can brighten up the sun area here. So let's add another basic mask. And here I think we'll go for a radial mask and paint that in here. Now this is actually going to start affecting outside of the sun. If I push the exposure all the way down here, you'll see that we're dealing to the exterior of this mask. So what we need to do is, one way of dealing to that is just click invert here. And now dropping that exposure that we just did is talking to the interior of this mask. So inside this circle, everything's 100%. And then between here and the external perimeter, that is a drop off from 100 to 0%, so that's a feathering off through there. So now we know what the mask is doing and where it's affecting. Let's just start to see if we can get the effect we were after. So let's increase the warmth. Far too much. Let's bring it down. Perhaps I don't want as much contrast through here because the sun coming up, I just want things to soften off through there. Let's bring the shadows up. That's going to help that. And we could bring the structure down to create a softer effect through there, but I don't want to do that too much because it starts to look a little painterly, a little bit fake, but we could do just a little bit on that slider. And then it's a question of, do we want to have a more saturated look where the sun is coming up? And let's go for that in this instance. Now I'm going to pull the sides of this in so that we can actually create a more elliptical effect. And now I'm going to grab outside and I can rotate that parallel with the horizon. What I may want to do is just refine the actual mask where it affects. And so I've used a couple of radial masks to create this effect here. But now what I'm going to do is just come back to my brush. So paint the mask. I'm going to select my eraser and just drop the opacity quite far down. So we've got a quarter of the effect, 25% here. And I'm just going to gently paint this mask away. And I'll do the same down here as well. Just ease that off the sand slightly. So let's turn that off and we can see that we don't really have much in the way of the orange yellow saturation, and then we can turn that on and now we've got more of an orangey glow through this area, which is enhancing the effect of the sunrise. The great thing with local masks is if you want to come back and edit any of these settings, you can do. So now for my final local mask, which will be affecting the sand here and increasing the contrast. Let's have a look at what we can do there. So we'll add the mask, we'll go for a basic mask, and this time to apply the mask I'm going to use the gradient mask, which is a really great way to deal with either skies or with foregrounds because the transition from top to bottom is smooth. So now we've got our mask applied, we are free to play around with these sliders and see what we can do. I'm going to crank the contrast pretty high up. And that's okay, but it's darkening this area here. So if I turn that off and turn it on again, we can see that we're definitely affecting the texture of the sand, but to the detriment of the brightness values, particularly on this right-hand side. So what I could do is increase the shadow brightness slightly and maybe ease that contrast back down. And probably a better way to bring out the detail in the sand ridges through here. Sand ridges, not sandwiches. Oh, it's making me hungry thinking about food. Sand ridges is to bring up the AI structure, and now we can see we've got a lot more detail going on through here. If you want to affect more of the sand, you can bring that up slightly and then pull the top part of the mask down so it's not affecting the sky. But the tighter you make this actual mask, the quicker that transition is going to change from 100% to 0. And I feel that if you can smooth that transition out, things just look a little bit more believable. And if we want to, we could actually change the color temperature of the sand. We could actually introduce more yellow tone through there and probably just ease that structure back just a little bit, just so it's not so intense. So now we should be able to look at our before and our after, our before and our after for this part of the image. Now I feel like we are quite bright up here and losing a lot of detail through the cloud, so I may just get one more gradient mask and just pull that from the top left through into here and just see by whether bringing down the highlights here, whether I'm just protecting the details up here. I don't really like having really bright areas in corners of the image or even at the sides of the photo anywhere really, because your eye goes to that bright part of the photo and I feel like your eye just kind of falls off the edge of the frame if it's too bright. So I could also bring the exposure down slightly if I wanted to do that there. And then let's have a look at our before and our after. It's just a subtle change there, bringing down that brightness value, but I'm pleased with that. Now I've got my local masks in place, what I like to do is actually just revisit the overall photo and just reassess whether I'm happy with the adjustments. And at the moment I'm thinking we're probably just a little bit oversaturated. I'm not 100% convinced that I'm happy with the color balance. And with the addition of structure through the cloud here and also more structure through the sand here, it might just be looking a little bit too contrasty. So let's just jump back to the Essentials collection here, and I'm going to jump into the light section once more and just play with the temperature. And as I've taken that away from that warm temperature that we had before, I actually think we've got a little bit more believable scene going on. Ease off that smart contrast too. I feel like we are slightly oversaturated, so I'm going to bring that down. I've just realized that I left that saturation slider all the way up on 40, and I said I normally just push that up as a temporary measure just while I'm playing around with those sliders so I can see more accurately how it's affecting the color, but I left it, and that'd be why it was oversaturated. So let's bring that back down, maybe somewhere around 13. Let's go with that. The difference between saturation and vibrance are often quite hard to pinpoint, so usually for me, I actually like to grab the sliders and play with them individually, and that just helps me visually understand what they're doing. So we might bring the vibrance up slightly, bring that saturation down a little further again, and now I'm happy with that. I'm ready just to finish off my image with the color toning. So there's a couple of ways that I like to do that. Let me show you the first one, and that is jumping straight into the mood section and just choosing a LUT, which helps to tie the whole image together. So as I roll over these, you can see how it's unifying the colors of the whole image. So now it's just a case of finding one that you like the look of. I think the Anaheim one here has got a nice balance between the blues and the yellows. So let's go with that for this. Contrast wise, yeah, let's throw in a bit of contrast. Do we want to saturate that effect? Yeah, let's put a bit of saturation in as well. So before and after. So that is one way to color grade your photo. Another way would be to jump into the Pro section and come into the color harmony. And there are some really cool tools in here, but one nice one would be to come to the split color warmth, and we can start to warm things up if we want to. And we can also play with the cools and change the color balance of those. So I'm going to push those to the left. And so if I turn that off and now on again, you can see that we've enhanced the oranges there and enhanced the blues up in that cloud as well. I don't think I'll take that quite as far for the blue of the cloud, but that's another really nice way to color tone your images. Coming down into the color balance is another really precise way to dial in colors. So we could jump into the highlights. So we're talking directly into these areas here, and we could perhaps bring up the reds if we wanted to, put in a little bit more yellow. And that's certainly helping to give a much warmer sunrise kind of feel to this, which is complemented by this dark brooding cloud here, which if we jumped into either the midtones or the shadows, we can sort of control the color more of that. So if I push those blues up all the way, or 73, let's go all the way, you can see that exactly where that toning is affecting. As with so many of these tools, it's really powerful, and 100% is far too much usually, but it's worth pushing it all that way so you can visually get a sense for what that slider is doing. And now you know, you can think, yeah, I don't want too much, but I do want some of it. We can further warm up our photo or cool it down with this slider here. We can add some brilliance to it, which is really saturating those colors. Or if we feel like we've pushed things a little bit too far by playing with the colors, we can actually start to desaturate it and then just bring it back to a point where we feel it might just be a little bit more believable. One way to correct your mistakes if you feel like you've taken things too far is to grab the sliders individually, or another way is to come down to the template as a whole, grab this slider here, and as you reduce that, you're taking away the whole effect. So if we see where we started with this photo here, and I start to increase that effect, you can see that we really have changed this photo. So I feel like the enhancement is over the top, for sure. I've pushed this way too much. I said I was going to freestyle. It's too much. So let me dial that back down somewhere around there. Come back into our color section. Maybe I want to reintroduce a little bit more saturation. So we're still getting a nice enhancement of color, but by bringing the template down as a whole, we haven't introduced so much of that structure that it's just too much. So let's have a look at our before. Let's have a look at our after. There is my freestyle edit, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not sure I'm 100% happy with all of my decisions that I've made, but cut me a little bit of slack, because talking you guys through my edit as I'm doing it often takes my focus away from what I'm actually doing while I'm trying to explain different tools and effects. So do me a favor, leave me a comment and let me know what was the tool that you think was the most beneficial for this particular edit. What would you have left out? What would you have done? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.